Brian. Yeah, I see lots of faces here I recognize, some of which are now 6 months older than last time I saw you. 6 months more distinguished. Sorry, from last time I saw you. So, Paul is here. I realized yesterday when I was introducing him at IRES that I've worked with Paul for more than half my life, which is pretty astonishing to say that, you know, we've kept interested in each other's thoughts and ideas and been able to get along for this period of time. Paul's work really appeals to me, and his thinking process appeals to me, because it's very much at the interface of the experimental work and public policy work. So there's researchers around the world who have kind of gotten their start, gotten their curiosity, gotten their initiation into experimental work because of Paul. I think we've had like 250 graduate students work with him, PhD students over the years. Paul is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. Through his other side, as president of this think tank in Eugene, Oregon, Decision Research, Paul has gotten involved in a large number of the most, I think, important public policy questions of the day. Climate change, smoking, citing nuclear power plants, all now a focus on humanitarian crises, a real concern about what we're doing about our nuclear weapon capability. Just sort of name a big education, energy transitions, you name these big issues, and Paul has found a way to both get involved in the public debate and work with decision makers, but also to base that consistently on a really solid empirical evidence. So if you want to move away from false facts and false news and move to something that really is evidence-based and has a solid basis for opinions, I think you can't do better than Paul's work. And he manages to keep going. He's just a curious mind. I'm curious to see what Paul will be working on 5 years from now. Probably will partly be an extension of things he's doing now, but maybe something brand new that he gets hooked onto. So in that sense also, I think Paul's really a model for the rest of us. So Paul's had 34 years to change my life, and he now has an hour and a half to change your life. So I welcome Paul Slovic.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure working with you for 34. I hope we have many more years to come. I don't really go into completely new things. That's sort of I evolve slowly and kind of hang on to old vestiges too, and I'll show that today. Thanks for coming out. It's a beautiful day. This topic is sort of depressing, I should warn you. But the world is troubled. And so I think it's better that we confront the problems and try to make it less trouble. And that's what the aim of the work we do is hoping to do. So you see the title. I'll elaborate on that at length. So a related problem to this is why do good people in their governments fail to act against genocide, mass atrocities, and other large-scale human and environmental catastrophes such as may result from nuclear war or climate change. And the problem, the overall problem that I worry about is, and some of the conclusions that I come to is that we are incoherent in our valuation of human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. And we do too little to protect human lives in the face of catastrophic threats, from violence, climate change, natural disasters, climate change and natural disasters, poverty, famine, and other large-scale problems that affect many people. So where I'm going in this talk, I'll describe 3 psychological obstacles to protecting lives in the face of catastrophic threat. 2 of these obstacles result from non-deliberative thought processes. The third is from biased deliberation, and these form the basis of what I call the arithmetic of compassion. And it's a flawed arithmetic. It's a very harmful arithmetic, as I'll try to illustrate. Actually, of the 3 biases, I'm going to focus primarily on 2, and I'll tell you which one I'm going to give a little bit less attention to later. So after World War II, we heard the mantra, never again. We're never going to let something like the Holocaust occur. But actually, catastrophic episodes of killing through genocides and mass atrocities are all too common. They create an immense toll of suffering and death, often with little notice or resistance from the outside world. And they also threaten global security. Samantha Power wrote this very important book, 2002, I believe it was published, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. It won the Pulitzer Prize. She was a journalist. She chronicled the failure of the U.S. government to respond to repeated episodes of genocidal attacks during the last century, and was very critical of the American government's failure to respond. And this is quite a litany of problems, but actually I gave a talk at a conference at Auschwitz in 2007 or 2008, and I met a scholar named Barbara Harf from the University of Maryland, and she presented this slide, which you won't be able to read in detail, but it's she had compiled a list of genocides and political mass killing from 1950 to 2003, and you see that there are many dozens of instances of, these aren't all genocides, some are just mass politicides with thousands and thousands of people in each event. So it is common, and we rarely react to it and intervene and stop it. And very recently, the Holocaust Museum put out a list where state-led mass killing is occurring. Very recently, a number of important domains, and again, with few exceptions, we don't pay too much attention to this. So why do we rarely intervene in mass murder, genocide, and other human and environmental catastrophes? There are many answers. There's no one simple factor to say, oh yeah, this is the cause. It's a multi-causal thing. I mean, primarily, it's dangerous, costly, and difficult to go into a sovereign nation that's killing its citizens and intervene. And so there are costs. Issues of racism, the problems that with things are happening far away from us, we pay less attention to them, and they seem less important. Diffusion of responsibility, why should we be the ones to intervene? Why can't other people do it as well? This is a very prominent theme of our current administration. It's other people should do their share. And then the three at the bottom are the ones that I focused on in recent years. They're psychological factors. Psychic numbing, the information that we get fails to convey affect and emotion and meaning. A false sense of inefficacy, and that's the one I'm going to spend less time on today in the interest of overall time. And then the third is the dominance of protecting national security over protecting foreign lives when decisions are made. And we link this to something I'll explain called the Providence Effect. So again, these are the three psychological obstacles. And much of my work has been influenced by, in cognitive psychology, what are called dual process theories of thinking. That we apprehend reality and think in two fundamentally different ways. We know this. Philosophers has talked about reason and the heart and the mind for centuries, and this quote from Einstein recognized it a long time ago. He says, when we are clear in heart and mind, only then shall we find courage to surmount the fear which haunts our world. This is in the dawning of the nuclear age. And I'll come back to this exact point in the last part of my talk, where I will address challenges of thinking rationally about nuclear weapons. But the heart and the mind is this duality. More recently, Daniel Kahneman, who was here in around 1980 as a professor and Robbins mentor, has written in 2011 this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's sold between 5 and 10 million copies. And it talks about this duality. We think in two ways: fast, intuitive based, and slow, deliberate, and reason-based thinking. And the problem, both are wonderful cognitive faculties that we have, and they both break down in certain instances. And particularly, fast thinking fails us in the face of humanitarian and environmental catastrophes, as I'll describe. So here's the two modes. Fast is sometimes called system one. It's not really a system, but we label it that. It's experiential. It's intuitive. It relies on images and associations that flip through our brains, instantly, and carry feelings. And these feelings are motivators of action. And it's also stimulated by stories or narratives, and it's often non-conscious. We're not aware of what we're doing. The other system is slow. It's what we're taught to do in school, think logically, deliberately, use mathematics, equations, symbols. It's very conscious, and it also constructs feelings, but at the back end, after we do an analysis, we judge something to be, really good or bad, or have some feeling we can attach to it. But it comes in at the back end. So fast thinking is our default mode of operating, of dealing with the world, and it's because it's easy, it's natural, doesn't seem to take effort. It feels right, it often works, but it can lead to serious mistakes. And one of those mistakes is that if you're relying on the feeling system, then the more who die, the less we care. And that's because of this concept that it actually comes from a poet, by a Polish poet named Zbigniew Herbert, where he used this phrase, the arithmetic of compassion. And basically, the way we address it is a recognition that the feeling system can't count. Saving one life is huge and important. If there's two people at risk, you don't feel twice as concerned about two than one. Maybe you feel a bit more, but in some cases you maybe feel a bit less concerned about two than you do about one. Rather strange reaction. And since adding and multiplying are closely related, the feeling system, not surprisingly, can't multiply either. And this has been recognized, and we find it in our research, but it's been known, and people have pointed this out. Annie Dillard, American nature writer, in 1999 was musing about what then was the population of China. 1,198,500,000 alive in China. Now, she said, to get a feel for what this means, and I highlighted feeling and meaning because much of meaning of information, it depends on how that information makes us feel. So to get a feel for what this means, just take yourself and all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1,198,500,000. See nothing to it, she says, and some of you are smiling. I'm sure she was smiling when she wrote this because she knows we can't do this. We're taught as young kids how to read and write, bigger and bigger numbers and to, add them and subtract them. We're not taught to think about how to understand the reality underneath the surface of these numbers. And interestingly, you get the same recognition of this from a very different person in a very different context. Szent-Gyorgyi was a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who became very concerned about nuclear war. And he says, I am deeply moved if I see one man suffering and would risk my life for him. Then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I am unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million. So at least people are actually good intuitive psychologists and recognize the fact that you can't multiply feelings in this way. The feeling system doesn't do this kind of arithmetic. So this leads to two basic questions. How should we value the protection of human lives, and how do we value the protection? And why do the answers to these questions differ, and why does this matter? I'll try to explain that. So let's look at the first question. Here are two normative models that we might put forth as ways we might wish to value lives as the number of lives at risk increase. So if we believe inherently that every life, human life, is equal in value, then the model on the left is just simply you add them up. As the number increases, the value increases, protecting them increases linearly. We might wish to tweak that a bit, as on the left, on the right rather, in the case when you're getting to the point where you're near a tipping point towards genocide or extinction of a species, the very next lives are even more important to protect than the ones before them because of the leading to an extinction. And so it curves upwards. But our actions in the face of catastrophic threats don't follow either of these two normative models. And that's because if we're on the fast system, our feelings override our analytic judgments. And as I mentioned, our feelings are insensitive to large losses of life. And so now we have two descriptive models which come out of research that look very different from the normative model. So instead of a straight line going up, you see a line that is very steep around small numbers of lives and then flattens out. And as if that's not bad enough because we become insensitive and don't change much as the numbers increase. In some cases we actually lose feeling and it starts to collapse, as in the model of the right, on the right. So let's look first at this left model, what we call a psychophysical type model. And there's something, this steep rise right at the beginning, between 0 and 1, is something that we call the Singularity Effect. We place great value on saving individual lives. This is again recognized by people who express it. Mother Teresa said, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will. Individual lives are important. And I collect material from our local newspaper that demonstrate the time and again where individuals will do heroic things to rescue someone in need in their vicinity. So in this picture, the man on the left, his truck went into the pond behind him, and the guy on the right saw it. He was driving by in a truck. He left his vehicle, jumped in the water, and rescued this person at some risk to himself. It happens all the time. Individual lives are important, and we'll endanger our own lives to rescue them. Now, in this next case, there's not a single life, but there were like a group of people that sort of appeared almost as one. You probably remember the cave rescue of the boys in Thailand. It was news all over the world for several weeks, and an immense amount of effort and money was spent to rescue these young men. So again, they had identities, and it's a small number, and we cared a lot about rescuing them. It doesn't have to even be people that the Singularity Effect takes place. Here's another story from our paper of an elk that went through thin ice in the Oregon Cascades, and these guys around must have been ice fishing. They saw this, they went into the freezing water and pulled the elk out of the water. It was a single elk, its life was important, and they rescued it. Another remarkable example is this dog. There was a ship that it had engine trouble off the coast of Hawaii. They got all the people off the ship, and then they let the boat drift, and they lost track of it. And then they realized it was this dog on the boat. And so they had to find the boat. And according to this story, it cost $300,000. The rescue mission of the dog cost $300,000. So individual lives, human or other, are very important to us. Now, opposite this Singularity Effect is psychic numbing, very dramatically illustrated by Rwanda in 1994, where the UN commander there was tipped off that this genocide was going to happen. He called for help to his UN boss, Kofi Annan, who said, no, you're just an observer there, you don't have authority to intervene with your troops and stop it. He then went to the Clinton administration and Madeleine Albright. They told him the same thing. So he just stood and kind of witnessed the atrocities of 800,000 people approximately murdered in 100 days. And the world let it happen, just the opposite of the Singularity. So in a sense, we've long known about the difficulties of dealing with statistics. Stalin said, this is probably not Stalin, it's attributed to him, one man's death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And we find in research that indeed statistics of atrocities don't move us to act. So the Assyrian War broke out in 2011. The government started to brutally attack rebel citizens. And in February of 2012, they were crying for help. As this clipping from CNN Online shows, as the death toll grows in Syria, so do desperate pleas for help. What's the world waiting for? Asked one Syrian woman while holed up in a makeshift bomb shelter with her 6 sons, for us to die of hunger and fear. This was in February 2012. The cries for help were going out. What happened after that point? There's an arrow in this next graph pointing to February of 2012. And you see that the death toll rolls steadily by September of 2015, there was about 250,000 statistical fatalities in the Syrian conflict. And then something dramatic happened, which most of you probably are aware of. This photograph appeared, a little boy trying to flee to the shores of Turkey with the family in a boat that capsized and the boy drowned and was washed up on the shore. And it was front page news all over the world. It had an impact. And we measured the impact. We did a study on this. And one simple way to measure the impact was to look at the searches on Google under the search term refugees in Syria before and after this picture emerged. And you see here that you see the spike due to the arrival of this photograph. So the statistics of 250,000 deaths didn't lead to people being interested in refugees or Syria, but the photograph did. And then you see it kind of over time it's started to reduce. One of my colleagues in this study is from Sweden. Sweden took in 150,000 Syrian refugees in 2015. Rather remarkable commitment by a country that had only about 8 or 9 million people. And then they started to collect money. They needed to collect money to help care for these 150,000. They created a fund with the Swedish Red Cross to get donations to help them. And that fund was going along at about $8,000 a day until the photograph came out. And then you see the spike. The day after the photograph came out, it went from $8,000 to $430,000. And then it took took a few months to dampen down again to where it was before. So you see there was an impact that the statistics of 250,000 deaths, people were sleeping through that, and then the photograph woke them up and energized them. They had an emotional impact. They wanted to do something where there was something they could do, like donating to the Red Cross. People did that big time. But then I think individuals ran out of things to do. Syria is a complex situation. Governments were struggling to figure out what to do with it. People didn't know what to do with it about it either. And then a year later, basically little had changed. The window of opportunity had closed, and these photographs can do only so much. And then I've got a few clippings that just says the same thing. Syrian refugee children have lost all hope. Young Syrians living in Lebanon are attempting suicide in even greater numbers. They started attacking Aleppo. An image of an injured child goes viral, but the fighting continues unabated. It had a short life, and people and governments didn't know exactly what to do, and so everything went back to normal. Aleppo was another hellish attack on citizenry that happened after that. So the lesson here is that visual experience, imagery in the form of experience is more powerful than numbers. When our emotions are aroused, there's a short window of time when we're motivated to act, and if we know what to do, if there's some option available to us that's seen as worthwhile or effective, we will take it because we're ready to go. If not, we go back to sleep. We turn our attention to other things in our lives that need our attention. Why make yourself miserable focusing on this horrible situation that you feel you can't do anything about. So you have a window of opportunity to act, and you need to have something to do. So controlled laboratory experiments, as Robin mentioned, demonstrate this numbing and collapse of compassion. I'll just briefly, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, mention a couple of these. After the Rwandan genocide, those who survived it fled to refugee camps on the border of Rwanda and what was then Chad. Large camps, they lacked clean water and began to suffer from cholera. And so my colleagues and I were looking for a scenario to test this value function that curves over. And we saw this story again in the paper about clean water being brought to the people in the camps by drilling new wells. And so we created an experiment around this. We said, supposing you're an official in a neighboring country, you want to help, you've only got enough money to provide pumping equipment and clean water that'll keep 4,500 people alive in the camp. But you've got other uses for your money. Domestically, you can improve your roads or your hospitals. Would you spend the money and provide clean water to keep 4,500 people healthy in the camp? Do it or not? We had two groups of people. In one group, we said you can help 4,500 people. The camp has 250,000. The other group, we said you can help 4,500. The camp has 11,000. You probably could guess which camp was more, where there was more motivation to send it. It was the smaller camp. Participants were much more willing to send clean water to save 4,500 lives in a refugee camp of 11,000 than to send water to save 4,500 lives in a large camp. And this fits very well the function on the left here, the fact that if you're going from 250,000 people at risk to 245,500, you're on the flat part of that curve. If you're going from 11,000 to 6,500, you're like cutting it in half. You're on the steeper part. It seems more important. This is a feeling response. This curve is based on feeling, because if you're reasoning analytically, there's no reason to think that first life, these early lives are less valuable when the problem's bigger. That's just the way our feelings mislead us. But what about the collapse side of it? There's also evidence from this in a variety of studies. An early study was done in Israel by Tehila Kogut and Elena Nataf. They had a scenario where they showed pictures of 8 children who were being treated for cancer in a children's hospital. They said that the 8 children needed $300,000 American for treatment, and asked people to donate if they would. And then they had another group that said they took individual children out of this photograph and said, this child needs $300,000 for the treatment, will you donate or not? And this is the average donation. You see that it's much greater for the single child than for the 8. Annie Dillard asked the question in one of her musings, at what number do other individuals blur for me? And it relates to a study that we did following this Israeli study about 1 versus 8. We wondered, what if it was just 1 or 2 children? So we had a scenario. We had 2 children in need of aid for facing starvation. People could donate on behalf of the little girl. Second group saw the little boy and as the motivator for donations. A third group were told that donations would go to both of these children, Rokia and Musa. And what one sees is that the feelings of sympathy and the donations were the same for the 2 individual children and dropped slightly for the combination. And they weren't gone, but there was a significant, statistically significant decline in donations and also feelings of sympathy. And going back to Annie Dillard's question, at what number do other individuals blur for me? One answer from this study is that individuals begin to blur and compassion begins to collapse at the number 2. It's not that it's gone. Why might that happen? We think it's an intentional phenomenon. You need to pay attention, to focus on a person, to connect with them emotionally, and you can't focus simultaneously on two people as closely as, and get as much information or connect with them as strongly as you can for one. It's an intentional phenomenon. It relates to what we call empathy. What is empathy? And mostly, we're familiar with the term, well, it's putting yourself in another person's shoes so you can feel like they do and think like they do and appreciate what they're experiencing. But what if there are two people? Well, by coincidence, when we were studying this, there was an art exhibit of Cuban art at the University of Oregon Art Museum, and there was a piece by a Cuban sculptor named Juan Capote titled Matrimony. It was intended to show the difficulties of two people in a marriage trying to get along with each other. And he created a shoe for two people. And I took a picture of it. It's a very awkward looking device. Just as it would be quite awkward to try to wear a shoe for two people, the human mind finds it awkward to try to empathize with two or more people at once when it's thinking fast. So rather strange type of connection here. So that's psychic numbing. The other problem is pseudo-inefficacy, the fact that we get demotivated from doing what we can do if attention is called to the fact that there's things we can't do. It doesn't feel as good to help this child if you realize there are other children you're not helping. And then you don't help the child if you can. A very bizarre kind of response, and I'm going to pass on that in the interest of time. But even knowing that there's one child out of two that you can't help makes you feel less good than helping the child that you can help. It may cause you not to help that child. I say this is wrong. It's a failure of fast thinking. You shouldn't be demotivated from doing what you can do just because you can't do everything. So the third component of this flawed arithmetic of compassion is a decision-making obstacle that even slow, reasoned decision-making requiring trade-offs can be severely biased towards, in the case of humanitarian action, protecting national security with little or no weight given to loss of human life. And we call this the Providence Effect, or something called imperative decision-making, which I'm not going to talk about. So this is going beyond numbing, that the top decision makers who hopefully are well informed and not numbed still decide not to intervene in mass atrocities, even when the actual or potential loss of life is enormous. And this concept of prominence comes from a paper that Amos Tversky and Shmuel Satat and I published in 1988 on what we call a contingent weighting model in judgment and choice, and it featured this thing called the prominence effect, which basically based on data that suggests that choices or decisions value certain types of dimensions or attributes very highly because of the need to justify or defend those actions. So if you think about values, we use the word values all the time. We hardly recognize that we may be incoherent in our values, but we can state our values. This is what's important to me. Protecting lives that are being subjected to genocide is important to me. Protecting national security is important to me. When you express your values, people don't kick back, they don't challenge you. That's your values, they accept your values. But if you make a decision that reflects your values, you often have to defend that action. And so things that make a decision defensible may not cohere directly with what you think is valuable, your stated values. There may be a disconnect between what you say you value and what your actions imply you value, your value. And I observed this. I was concerned about the failure to respond to genocides and atrocities. And it seemed to me, just looking at case histories, that security was a major factor that got in the way of protecting human lives. That for governments, national security is the most prominent, that is the most defensible value in today's world, and that strongly held humanitarian values, which we state, tend to decline or even collapse when they're pitted in decision-making against security objectives. So if you're facing a crisis, a humanitarian crisis, you're thinking about an action, well, there's alternative actions, and there's multiple things at stake, pros and cons. How do you weigh and balance those? And the Providence Effect says it's very difficult to make those trade-offs. We look for a simpler way to deal with it, and one way to deal with it is to go with the more important defensible actions. So again, to repeat myself, when humanitarian life-saving and national security seem to conflict, we don't intervene, no matter how many thousands or millions of lives hang in the balance. And prominent examples are the genocide that has been taking place in Darfur, Sudan for a long time, and other continuing atrocities in Sudan. There's a lot of instances of this. And you can think of this as, we think about when you have conflicting objectives, you have to kind of weigh and balance these to try to come up with some result of which way to go. And the Providence Effect can be thought of as like relating to limits of attention and putting an intentional spotlight on part of the problem. So in this case, national security, the focus of the discussion is about security, and foreign lives just get forgotten about. It's not an intentional devaluation of foreign lives. It is due to, they just kind of fall off the table because the focus is on national security. A few anecdotal examples from recent administrations in the U.S. George Bush said the most important job I've had and the most important job the next president is going to have is to protect the American people from another, he's referring to another 9/11 attack. So we're still seeing the consequences of 9/11 very strongly in our country. And he's right about the next president, because Obama said the same thing. I have a solemn responsibility to keep the American people safe, and that's my most important obligation as president and commander-in-chief. But Obama openly recognized the importance of protecting people who are being abused in other countries. He says America, he acknowledged very real and legitimate humanitarian interest in Syria in this case. At this point, 80,000 had been killed, and millions had lost their homes. He acknowledged real and legitimate interest. But he recently said his bottom line has to be what's in the best interest of American security. So in multiple instances, we see a retreat from action. In Sudan, the president of Sudan murdering the black African population. We were getting intelligence information from the government about Al-Qaeda operations. So that was valuable. And other countries were supporting the president. We didn't want to ruffle some of our allies' feathers by attacking the government. And so we have done nothing in that case. Security trumps that. Okay, so very quickly I'm going to go to something, a new extension of this work, which has to do with moving from genocide to nuclear war, and this is the title of a paper in progress on this, the caveman and the bomb, psychological obstacles to rational decision-making about the use of nuclear weapons. So, I don't know why I am failing to advance my slide. That's interesting. So this is a newer, I wonder, is there a techie person who can try to figure out why I can't advance the slide? Maybe the computer's fatigued. Okay, that's good. Let's see if it will go back and forth. Thank you very much. Okay. So for 2 decades, I've studied these psychological mechanisms that lead to inaction in the face of genocide. That's what I'm talking about, is turning your back and not acting because security overrides humanity. And next I'll argue that these same mechanisms, psychic numbing and security provenance, also helps explain not inactions, but actions that have been taken or planned intended to kill vast numbers of human beings with nuclear weapons. I shall conclude that decisions to use nuclear weapons cannot be rational, as they will unleash immense consequences that we are unable to comprehend, and only non-use can be rational. So if we can't appreciate if we start to lose compassion at the number 2, how can we think rationally about killing tens or hundreds of millions of people for some benefit? How do we do that benefit-cost trade-off? I don't think we can do it. So the lessons that we've just heard about is that mass killing is common in the genocide and atrocity. It's not that we don't kill people en masse, it happens all the time. It's tolerated, and what are the implications for the use of nuclear weapons? I think one of the implications is don't be so sure that we're not going to use nuclear weapons again, because we're not averse to mass killing of people. Albert Einstein, after helping spur the development of the bomb, became very much anti-war, anti-bomb. And in 1946, he said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." And he and his other atomic scientists started an educational program. They went around the country giving lectures about the dangers of war and nuclear weapons. Here was a plea at the time, $200,000 in 1946, which he got, and they did this. He was very concerned about this, and he referenced to the fact that we need to change our thinking here, or we're in trouble. So now we go to 2018. What have we learned about our modes of thinking in the last 72 years? Have we understood and changed our thinking in ways that we reassure Einstein? And I don't believe we have done this. So let's focus on the decision-making problem. And here's a phrase from a recent publication I saw, which I completely agree with. "No human decision is more fraught than one involving the use of nuclear weapons, a decision on which may ride the lives of millions of people and potentially the fate of civilization." Yes, but there are obstacles to rational thinking here, which are what I've been talking about, the inability to comprehend the consequences of killing, mass killing, psychic numbing, and this faulty decision-making, the Providence Effect. And there's yet another factor that's going on in this commission of action as opposed to omission, and that is in some cases, we not only do our minds numb us inadvertently because of the limitations, sometimes we intentionally numb ourselves by dehumanizing the victims, or psychic numbing and compassion collapse inadvertently lead to deficient feelings regarding losses of life because of these cognitive and emotional limitations. But tribalism, dehumanization, victim blaming deliberately allow mass killing to be perpetrated without challenge from normal feelings. So we have seen over and over again that these mechanisms are used not only by perpetrators to initiate genocide, but it's also been done in warfare. This kind of us against them mentality, where we say, the lives of the others are not as valuable, or we view them as insects or vermin, and therefore it makes it easier to attack them, to kill them. So in World War II, when the U.S. government viewed Japan as an enemy, all Japanese people were considered to be an enemy. And even those who were U.S. citizens were forcibly relocated to isolation detention camps in the U.S. They were dehumanized, made it easy to harm them. There were many such posters like this one, where you have the caricature Japanese person and a cockroach hand in hand, and the enemies both. It's your job to help eliminate them. So this opens the door to attack, as we did in 1945 and other. So another thing that was going on, and again with the us versus them and the security problems, was the incidents such as blocking entry to the U.S. There was ships carrying refugees from the escapees from the Holocaust trying to get into the U.S. And the State Department, the government, turned back the ships, within sight of the U.S. And this is a bulletin from the State Department in 1941, referring to why this was done. It says, when the safety of the country is in peril, so this is the national security, it seems fully justifiable, some justification and defensibility, fully justifiable to resolve any possible doubts in favor of the country rather than in favor of the aliens. So security over humanity. Well, flash forward 74 years to 2015, you get exactly the same story from a senator from Indiana who is now our Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, was talking about letting refugees into his state of Indiana. He says, while the U.S. is a compassionate and welcoming country, our government has an obligation to protect American citizens. We should not accept any Syrian refugees in Indiana or across the country unless the U.S. government can guarantee with 100% assurance that they are not members, supporters, or sympathizers of ISIS. So slam the door, make sure we don't want any risk, and without really thought of the lives that are being harmed, vast numbers of lives that are being harmed by this policy. So numbing and prominence enable mass killing, as well as dehumanization. So unfortunately, the numbing and compassion deficits are not just figments of our laboratory experiments. They appear to occur frequently in the annals of warfare. And when I started to look into some of the nuclear stuff, I see that there's even better examples of numbing and prominence in this arena than there was in the inattention to genocide. So as we've seen with genocide and mass atrocity, there's no taboo against mass killing in support of some what seems to be important or prominent military and security value. So even before the U.S. had nuclear weapons, American commanders did not refrain from using conventional firebombs to attack cities and civilians, for example, in Dresden or in Tokyo, with destructiveness comparable to or even greater than that which occurred in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Deliberate firebombing of Tokyo, planning on when the winds would be maximal to disperse the flames, and knowing that they're killing civilians. This is an attack on a city with civilians. There's a remarkable book that came out in the last year by Dan Ellsberg. Has anyone read this book, Doomsday Machine? Ellsberg is famous for the Pentagon Papers. His field is decision-making, economics. He has a PhD in decision-making from Harvard, but he got deterred. He went to work for Rand Corporation. He was so bright they put him in intelligence. They sent him to Vietnam to verify why our presence in Vietnam was winning the war. He went there. He was appalled by what he saw, and he came back. And what he saw was completely contrary to what the American government was telling the people about how successful we were in Vietnam. And he wrote a memo about it, how bad it was going. He gave it to Henry Kissinger, who trashed it, and he was very upset. And so he then had access to these government papers which were showing the problems of being withheld from the public, and he released those as the Pentagon Papers, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment by Richard Nixon, who called him the most dangerous man in America. But his sentence was overturned on a technical problem, and by that time Nixon was in big trouble, and they never retried him again. So he's quite a courageous person. He even brought his son, 14-year-old son, in to help him copy these papers on these old photocopiers, both because he needed the help and because he wanted to get his son, bring his son into doing something courageous, even at risk. So he also then became in the inner circle of planners for nuclear weapons. and he collected a lot of material there, which he only recently released in this book. So I'll do a little bit of reading, cognizant of the time, but apologize for the length of this, but it's pretty remarkable. So he reports an example of, one example I think is a dramatic illustration of numbness to consequences. So technical advances allowed substitution of H-bombs for A-bombs in planning for a possible war against the Soviet bloc, thus raising the expected death toll from executing this war plan from about 15 million in 1955 to 200 million in 1961. So right after the World War II was over, we turned our sights on Russia, the Soviet Union, and China, and they laid out the targeting and had these missiles targeting cities, which were in 55 it was 15 million people in sites because the bombs were smaller, and then they got bigger bombs and they kept the targets the same, but it raised it to 200 million. Ellsberg says the change was introduced not because it was judged by anyone to be necessary, but because it was simply what the new, more efficient nuclear bombs, cheaper but vastly larger in yield than old ones, could and would accomplish when launched against the same targets. And he notes that the risk the presidents and joint chiefs were consciously accepting, however small they saw the probability of carrying out this plan, involved the possible ending of organized society, the very existence of cities in the northern hemisphere, along with the deaths of nearly all its human inhabitants. And then later he got access to other plans that had 600 million people targeted in the Soviet Union and China. And he says these fatalities, this is JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were reporting to the White House, were the estimated result of the U.S. first strike. The total death count from our own attacks in the neighborhood of 600 million dead, almost entirely civilians, 100 holocausts. And he said these were just U.S. warheads. This didn't take into account the possible retaliation by the Soviets, which would amplify this. And a very dramatic passage in the book where he says, I remember my feelings holding the graph of these fatalities, planned fatalities in my hand. The answer to my query, he queried the president to get access to this data, covering only the Soviet Union and China. Looking at it in an office of the White House annex on a spring day of 1961, and I remember thinking, this piece of paper should not exist. It should never in the course of human history have come into existence. It depicted evil beyond any human project that had ever existed. There should be nothing on earth, nothing real that it referred to. So this is one example, again, of the numbing of these numbers to plan this out for, what military gain could be worth this. There's another example that he gave. There was a document called SIOP, it's a strategic planning document. Well, actually, this is from someone else named Scott Sagan. Notes a key passage in this briefing's text. While personnel casualties would be somewhat reduced if urban industrial installations were not directly attacked, nevertheless, because of fallout from attack on military targets and co-location of many military targets with urban centers, the casualties would be many millions in number. And if you just limited attacks to military targets and not the cities, it would have little practical meaning as a humanitarian measure, because already you're killing millions, and so kill some more millions, it wouldn't really make any difference. So this is horrible, and then there's a question of how would public opinion be with regard to the constraint on using weapons, and it may not be a constraint, at least in the U.S., in the use of weapons in wartime. There was a study just a couple of years ago, last year, by Scott Sagan and Ben Van Valentino out of Stanford, called, where they did a simulation, a survey, in which they had created a hypothetical scenario about war, a future war with Iran, that land war that was jeopardizing the lives of 20,000 Americans. And they asked people, would you support an American's decision to use a nuclear weapon that would kill 2 million Iranians in order to protect 20,000 American troops? Would you support it? And they found that 60% of the American population said they would support the use of the weapons for this. So they demonstrate that, contrary to any nuclear taboo thesis, a clear majority of Americans would approve of this using weapons against the civilian population of a non-nuclear armed adversary to save 20,000. So again, we see the precariousness and the threat here. We have this well-known bluster by Trump not too long ago about totally destroying North Korea, a country of 25 million people. He certainly didn't, who knows what he was thinking. It raised the question of, keeping the button away from this one guy, and it raises the more serious question, what's the nuclear chain of command? How many people are involved in overseeing the decision that can start from the president? And in 1981, a lawyer named Roger Fisher made a proposal which I think brings home the incoherence between the singular importance of protecting individual lives and the acceptability of mass killing. He proposed that the secret code that the president needs to initiate a nuclear attack be implanted near the heart of a person whose life would have to be sacrificed in order to begin the process of killing millions. Well, of course, we wouldn't do that. That would be, unthinkable to kill a person to get this code. So it shows how bizarre our thinking is on this incoherent. So to conclude, I think Einstein was right about the need to change our modes of thinking. Have we progressed enough in 82 years to avoid unparalleled catastrophe? If not, how should nuclear policy and strategies change to accommodate the severely bounded rationality that I've described, and the added challenge? And there's another challenge of social media, which I'm not going to go into now, which further can, inflame passions. So that's basically the story. I think it's naive to think that we're not going to use these weapons in the future, that there's some taboo that will block us, and what reason is there to believe that we're now in some new enlightenment age where we will no longer behave this way? I'm not that optimistic. So what are a few of the implications? Well, certainly to slow down the decision process, try to bring other decision makers in there for use, to kind of, so one person can't launch these on their own will. And also, the third bullet is particularly important. In this most important decision, would you think that the decision maker would be trained about how to do this? To my knowledge, there is not training of our president in how to think about the trade-offs involved between some military objective and killing vast numbers of people. And in fact, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the Strategic Air Command wrote about how they do a lot of military war games and exercises to train lower levels of command on how to deal with these crises, but they don't involve the president. Why don't they involve the president? He said it would be highly undesirable to have the president participate personally in the presidential decisions made in these exercises and war games, because it might tend to provide an adversary with insights into what he or she might actually do in a crisis. So how bizarre is that? And the most important decision any human would have to make, that when you're practicing all the execution part of the decision, you don't practice the decision to launch or not. That seems really insane to me. So I think starting with these experiments and about thinking, fast and slow thinking, and what we found about numbing and these other decision flaws, it raises questions about whether we can actually, we have created devices, these weapons whose consequences we cannot comprehend. Even with slow thinking, the reality killing 100 million people, what it would do to our civilization. So how can we make a rational decision about what to trade against this when we can't understand the consequences? I think the ultimate implication is in the bottom is that we have to work towards elimination of nuclear weapons. It's not going to happen overnight or easily, but how can we begin to further reduce the arsenal, put other controls on it, so an individual like Trump acting out of passion can't suddenly issue an order to fire at North Korea and this sort of thing. What else can we do, recognizing that we should no longer be naive to think that this will happen? So this is a long story. I apologize for haranguing you like this on a sunny afternoon. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.